Hi, this video is on the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 13. I'm going to start by reading that to you. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to do punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honour, then honour. My small group first endured me talking about these verses a couple of weeks ago, and I said at the time that I wasn't going to give a list of different COVID regulations and rules on face masks and separation and give them a Bible rating or a stamp based on the authority that we talk about in Romans 13. And as more regulation looks likely to come out in the coming weeks, I think it's important to say that again. But it is natural to read chapters like these and to think, how does this apply to me? How does it apply to my situation? I think that's a good thing. And as Christians, we are instructed to do that, to read the Bible and to apply its relevance to us in our Christian 21st century walk today. And we maybe as a church look and think we have a COVID or a coronavirus problem just now. We are used to meeting physically in large numbers. We maybe miss group worship or miss Sunday services. We miss that interaction, that hustle bustle and that chaos that we're sometimes used to. We feel this is maybe being stifled and shut down, that we are being restricted and closed or even criminalised by our government and by our authority. Maybe for the first time in your life you feel restricted, or for the greatest time in your life you feel like you're not allowed to live the way you want to because of the restrictions our government puts on us and how we currently live. So I think as a bit of a primer, there's value in looking at the first century Christians that Paul wrote this letter to, because they were living under a particular government, under a particular authority. That was Rome and Caesar. Now, I'm not a historian, but I've used the internet and taken some creative license. The book of Romans was maybe written in 57 AD, certainly in the mid-1st century. This was when Nero was Caesar. Emperor Nero ruled from 54 AD to 68 AD. History remembers Nero as a tyrant. Certainly early church history, early church tradition doesn't remember Nero favourably. Rome was the capital seat of his government, of his authority, and Rome was a big sprawling nation which conquered and enslaved other nations round about it. They enslaved people. Nero hosted fighting games with gladiators. He persecuted Christians. Rome had its own gods. Nero could have become a god in this Roman god structure if the Senate decided he was to be after he died. This was a tough place to be a follower of Jesus. Rome also operated a very effective tax system. It sucked the finances from its regions, from its provinces, and centralised them for its government, for its authority to decide what to do with. So I've included verse 7 in my reading, and we'll come back to that shortly. This Roman authority is the authority which Paul was telling the Romans to submit themselves to. It's the government which is engaged in these morally corrupt activities which fall short of the standard Jesus teaches in the Gospels. Verse 2, authorities that exist have been established by God. We can read that Paul is starting to establish a natural order here, that the authority of God sits above the authority of man. Verse 4, for the one in authority is God's servant. Without God's authority, man doesn't have authority. A servant has no authority if you remove the master. He's only a man. He goes about acting out the master's deeds because the master gives his authority to him. And we can see that analogy in what Paul writes, that those in authority are God's servants. They gain their authority through the fact God first has his. God is sovereign and has all authority, and governments get their authority through him. This concept of derived authority isn't a new one in an earthly sense. We're all used to an employer acting on the authority of their boss, or potentially a police officer making an arrest on the authority of the chief constable. But it's also not a new concept from a biblical sense either. In the Old Testament teachings, we can see Daniel 4 verse 3, how great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is everlasting. And on to verse 34, we can see King Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest, most powerful, richest rulers, one of the most powerful authorities that ever lived. And King Neb says, I lifted my eyes to heaven. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. The recognition of God's authority and then man's authority. In Genesis, we can see potentially God's first government. We see that God created man in his own image. Verse 27, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over it. God creates man in his image. That's God's authority. Man is to subdue it and have dominion over it. And we see the second tier, man's authority, because of God's authority first. In Daniel 2:21, another verse, it is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men. I think this is a concept which is also consistent with other New Testament teachings, other letters to other regions. Titus 3 verse 1, remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good. God's authority first, and then man's authority. And importantly, it's also consistent with the teachings of the Lord Jesus. And this is the tax verse that I said I was going to come back to. I'm going to paraphrase Mark chapter 12, verses 14 here for a bit of brevity. They come to Jesus and ask him, is it right to pay the imperial tax or not? And recognizing their trap, Jesus replies, bring me a denarius, bring me a coin. He gets the coin. He asks them, whose is this image? Whose inscription? Caesar's, they reply. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. We see God's authority and man's authority. Jesus tells us to pay our taxes to Caesar, but to give to God what is God's. This is his endorsement of respecting the local authority, not necessarily his endorsement of the actions of that authority itself. Ultimately, that tax denarius, that tax coin, could have paid for the arresting officers who took Jesus. It could have paid to fit out the courtroom where he stood mock trial. It could have furnished Herod's palace where Pilate sat in his seat of authority. It could have paid for the nails which hung him to the cross. The point isn't to make a big deal out of paying our tax. The point is that Jesus, who was a sinless man, Jesus, who was Son of God, who had the authority, who could have said, no, I'm not paying that tax coin. no, I'm not paying that debt of sin, which he ultimately settled on our behalf. But he did, and that is God's authority over man's authority. I had some thoughts, and I can maybe hear you thinking them too, about what about bad authorities, examples of bad governments here on earth. What happens when things are inverted, when the authority of man becomes more important than anything? What about, Pyongyang, or about the 30s and 40s in Germany? What would you do then in these hypothetical situations that you can think of in your head, or these real ones that happened? What about examples from the Bible when authority of man wasn't followed? And I've looked to the book of Daniel for an Old Testament example of how to deal with this in a Romans 13 way. And we're back to King Nebuchadnezzar here. We see Jerusalem sacked by Nebuchadnezzar's authority, and Daniel, Belteshazzar, is taken with his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're taken by this non-God-honouring authority, and they are pressured into giving up their faith, pressured into giving up their God-honouring way of life. And for me, it climaxes in chapter 3, when the rest of the kingdom is getting forced to kneel to this giant gold statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the furnace is blazing, and this is what they say when faced by King Nebuchadnezzar in the fire. We do not defend ourselves before you in this matter. They admit their guilt. They say, we're not following your rules, King Nebuchadnezzar. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. Chapter 3, verse 17. They re-establish God's authority over King Nebuchadnezzar's authority. And on to verse 18. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold. They take their punishment and they're thrown into the fire. And ultimately we potentially see Jesus in that fire there with them. That was an example of them being pressured into committing, of bowing to another statue, of the idolatry involved in that, committing a sin. And a New Testament example in Acts 4:19 is to admit a commandment of God. We see Peter and John disobeying the authority, which is trying to prevent them from spreading the gospel. And this is what they say: whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than God, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. They re-establish God's authority. We cannot stop speaking about it because they must, because of the Great Commission. But they also nod to man's authority. If this is right in the sight of God, you be the judge. There's two examples there which are fairly clean cut. One being forced to do something you shouldn't by the authority, or one where you are omitting to be a follower of Jesus because of what the authority wants you to do. But there are some difficult areas in life. We are not just reenacting the chapters of the Bible. We are writing our own chapters on what it's like to be a follower of Jesus today. So what do we do in those grey areas? There's some good advice in 1 Timothy chapter 2. It says, I urge you then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercessions and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and those in authority, that we may live a peaceful and quiet lives in all goodness and holiness. We are told to pray for those in authority as our first matter of recourse in those difficult occasions where we think, is it right? Has this been inverted? Should I follow man's authority, or is following God's authority to do something different here? First of all, we are urged to pray, to petition for those in authority over us.